Good morning, everyone. My name is John Badger, Vice President of Marketing and Product Management here at ShareVault. I would like to thank all of you for joining our webinar today, Building a Better Partnering Presentation, with Linda Pullan of Pullan Consulting. This is number 11 in the ShareVault webinar series. This webinar is hosted by ShareVault, the innovation leader in secure document sharing. ShareVault is used extensively by life sciences companies worldwide for securely sharing documents during due diligence for partnering, licensing, fundraising, and M&A. In addition, we have an increasing number of life sciences companies using ShareVault for securely sharing documents with CROs, CMOs, regulatory advisors, and other third parties during the entire drug, diagnostic, or device development lifecycle. The presenter today is Linda Pullan of Pullan Consulting, a consultancy specialized in offering advice to clients on biopharma partnering both in and out licensing. Linda applies more than 20 years of drug industry business experience to helping her clients get deals done. Linda previously presented a webinar with us entitled Getting Ready for a Biopharma Partnering Deal. This introductory Partnering 101 presentation was very well received, and attendees asked if we could continue with a deeper dive into the nitty-gritty of the partnering process. Today's webinar will focus on the details of preparing your partnering presentation. Whether you're preparing your elevator pitch, a one-pager, or a non-confidential deck, this first impression plays a key role in getting to a definitive deal. Linda will dig into real-world examples and provide practical tips on content, organization, and style. Today's presentation is in fact the first part of a three-part webinar sequence on best practices for biopharma partnering. The second webinar of this sequence, coming in January, will be focused on valuation, and the third on negotiation strategies. So stay tuned for more relevant webinar content coming from us soon. After Linda's presentation, there will be a brief ShareVault demo given by Steve Joseph, our Vice President of Market Development, followed by a question and answer session. At any time during the webinar, you can submit questions via the question box located in your GoToWebinar control panel. With this many attendees, it is likely that we will receive more questions than can be answered in the allotted time. If your question is not answered during the Q&A session, rest assured that we will respond to you via email after the webinar. A recording of the webinar will be available on our website shortly, and you will also be invited to a ShareVault where you'll be able to download the slides in PowerPoint format. Now let's get started. I would like to introduce Linda Pullan of Pullan Consulting, who will begin the presentation.
Thank you, John. I'm delighted to be here, and thanks to ShareVault for hosting this webinar. My first slide here is what's in it for me, and I think you in the listening audience are asking yourself what's in it for you for this presentation. That is the question that is always in audiences' minds as they start out in any presentation, and so that's really one of the key focus of our thinking about how to build a better partnering presentation, is addressing what's in it for the audience. Today, I'm going to walk through some of the components to think about in building a better partnering presentation. With that key audience focus, what's in it for me, why this one? We'll talk briefly about the partnering process, about the kinds of questions partners ask, the types of partnering presentations, the difference between confidential and non-confidential decks, a bit about the logic and structure of your story, and a few tips and tricks to make them clearer, prettier, crisper, all geared to make it extremely easy for your audience to appreciate and get your story. I'm not a graphics designer. As John mentioned, I'm a business development consultant. I do spend some time helping shape presentations and messages as well as doing the other tasks of partnering. And I've tried to pull the things I've learned from doing in-licensing for big companies like Amgen and AstraZeneca, and from helping my many small company clients in the years since. but I'd absolutely love to hear your tips and suggestions and tricks as well, because I'm sure I can learn a lot more, and it's an everlasting process to make a better partnering presentation. So I think of it as a partnering pitch, and that is an attempt to sell, or the first dictionary definition is to throw with careful aim, and that is really what we're trying to do. We're trying to sell by carefully aiming our messages for our audience. One of the challenges of partnering presentations is that often we are talking to a diverse set of people with different functional backgrounds, different expertise, and often we're addressing a presentation first to a business development representative who then acts as our representative and shares that information with the rest of the team. And so it's a challenge because you have to shape the partnering presentation differently than you would if you were just speaking to a single person and speaking live. So let's talk a bit about the partnering process and how that shapes the different types of presentations. The partnering process is a subset or a specialization of the old sales cycle. In the sales cycle, you identify a prospect, you qualify them, you make a proposal, you close a deal, and you deliver the goods. The partnering process is much the same thing, but I think in our industry we have a richer beginning because we're selling a very complex, often full of intangible values, information content offering. A big part of our partnering process is indeed defining our value proposition, defining the content of the partnering presentations. Then there's the outreach where we identify potential partners and we qualify them, that is, we find partners for whom our opportunity provides a strategic fit. But very importantly, we listen both to the negative feedback, the most common feedback, and the positive feedback to reiterate and redefine our value proposition, enhance the components of the story that resonate or fix the problems that are highlighted. And hopefully we get to deal concepts, negotiations, and a real-life partnership. So to address the different stages of the partnering process, there are different types of partnering presentations. And all of them are aiming at telling your value proposition, at getting to the next step in the deeper discussions of communicating when you are not there. When you've done it really well, you'll know, or hopefully you'll know, that your partnering document has been excerpted as the best possible representation of the story for the partner's internal decision-making process. They think you've done it so well, they're not going to modify your presentation. That's awesome. Partners are filtering your pitches a lot. So you're competing with a lot of opportunities. In a large pharmaceutical company, a given therapeutic area might see 500 opportunities a year. And at each stage in the partnering process, fewer and fewer make it to the end, and perhaps for a therapeutic area, 3 deals might be signed. So the aim here at each step is to be distinguishable, to be specific, to rise above the noise, and to work our way down this partnering triage. So at the beginning, you're not aiming for a deal, you're aiming to get to the next step. One of the nice things about our industry is that the other side is actually trying hard to find that deal as well. So the good thing is they're eager to find the opportunities. You're eager to help them find the opportunities. That can make business development a lot more pleasant. So what does a partner want to know? I think there are only a handful of key big conceptual questions. And the number one question is, why this one? What unmet need does this address? What makes it special? How does it compare to all the competition and the things on the market? The second big question is, what is its potential? And that's often market potential, but often it's the surrogates for market potential. It's the surrogate of mechanism and in vivo data and the evidence for its position in the marketplace. The partner is always asking themselves, and perhaps of you, what are the risks and when can they be addressed? The sooner they can be addressed, the less worrisome they are. The worst is to have something pop up in phase 3 or even on the market and kill the drug. Some of the surrogates for risk, or the subsets of risk, are the completeness of the data and the practical nature of the drug. Is it really drug-like? Those are big questions. The other big category of questions asked by the partner is, what will I have to do and spend to get revenues? What is the path to the market? Is there a fast path? Is there orphan status? What's the special niche I'm going to fill? And then how am I going to demonstrate value in the marketplace so that I can get the insurance companies to pay for it, the governments to acknowledge and reimburse it? Increasingly these days, that last question, what will I have to do and spend to get revenues, is being asked of the small companies even at the very beginning. So you really do want to think about that and be prepared to address that. So let's talk about the different types of partnering presentations, starting with the smallest, the elevator pitch or the teaser. The elevator pitch was historically that thing that you would have ready, so if you happen to bump into somebody, step onto an elevator, ride to an upper floor with them, you'd have a short little conversation about what exciting opportunity you had to offer and why they should be interested enough to follow up with the next step. So it needs to be short. Oh, and the teaser is the written equivalent of the elevator speech. It needs to be short, needs to be specific to you, needs to be focused on what's special, why this one, and moving toward the next step and being ready for a call to action. Okay, what is the next step? One of the key components of all these partnering presentations is addressing the level of detail to the audience. And in general, for partnering presentations, we're aiming at someone who has a scientific background but is not an expert within the space where your opportunity is. So one of the challenges always is to remember what you didn't used to know and to avoid specific vocabulary, jargon, assumptions about the context. It's really challenging for a partner to appreciate what the value judgments need to be. So you need to help that partner to the proper judgment calls. And that means you really do need to tailor this to a scientist, but not assume a great specific knowledge of your area. So an elevator speech or a teaser is different from a mission statement. A mission statement is aspirational. I want to cure cancer or help patients, and generally isn't specific enough to allow the partner to make any decision about how it fits. So we want more specificity for that. So let's get into some real-life examples. So the first one here is from Immune, and it's talking about a next generation of antibody payload technology. And the elevator speech jumps right into that key question of why this one. It has 4 or so bullets of what's special about this antibody payload technology, and ends with the action Immune wants, Immune seeking partners to apply the technology to their own antibodies. Good, simple, relatively short, fairly specific, hopefully not too much jargon, elevator pitch or teaser. Here's another example from Regenerex. What is it? Why this one? Breakthrough success in phase 2 trials. What action is wanted? Here's an interesting twist in that Regenerex has actually highlighted that they're looking for a single partner for all indications because it's the same manufacturing process of making these facilitating cells. Love that specificity. Get to the point. So let's move on to the next level of complexity, which is a one-pager or executive summary. I really do think they should try to be one page. They're often 2 pages, and that's probably acceptable. But they're a written document, and so we need to think about how we actually read written documents. We start from the top left and move to the bottom right, which means the things you think they must see should be up to the top left. We don't actually read very much these days. We skim and then decide what we want to read. So use things to guide the eye to what's important, and use message statements in bold or colored or headings to make it easy to get that message. Dense text turns people off, so try to use lots of white space, and it needs to be relatively uncluttered and unconfusing. So let's get to an example. Here's one from Origin. Nice graphic heading, starting out with what it is and what they're seeking, going on to the market potential and why this one, the advantages compared to other opportunities, and the contact info. Pretty good looking, one page, and a nice example of a one-pager. One-pagers are very, very tough, and sometimes I don't use them because it's challenging to find the right balance between all that information and being overwhelming. So sometimes companies can go just from the teaser, which can be used as an introduction in an email, right on to the non-confidential presentation, which can be attached with that teaser. So let's talk about the non-confidential deck, the workhorse of partnering presentations. I put up here a VC deck because many young companies are working on investor decks, and they are different from a partnering presentation. An investor deck has to be very, very short and very crisp, but has a different focus from a partnering presentation. An investor deck is really concerned about the team and their experience, and about the financials, how you will deliver an exit or return for your investors. That focus on the who and the dollars is very different from the focus of a partnering presentation. A partnering pitch is aimed at the what, not the who. And indeed, price tag is not really a selling point in general. A decision is made first about, am I interested? And price comes much later in the process. So the dollar amount per se is not the driving force. So in a partnering presentation, you do want to go through the basic answers to those key questions and catch them at the beginning and drive through your data to a summary that reiterates the key points so they're left with something to remember. Again, those components of the partnering presentation are really aiming at those big questions. Why this one? What's its potential? What are the risks and when will they be addressed? And what will I have to do and spend to get revenues? You don't necessarily in a non-confidential presentation have to spend a lot of time on the risks and when they will be addressed. You can leave that for a later stage. But if there's an elephant in the room, that is, if you've got a problem that everybody's going to bring up, it's better to address it rather than wait. You do want to provide them enough information to make a strategic fit decision. But you don't want to put everything in the non-confidential presentation because your primary purpose is to aim for clarity. You want a simple, straight line to the takeaway message. If it doesn't lead you down the path to your key messages, if it's a little extra, you probably want to throw it out. Because in this presentation, you're not trying to convey the entire story, you're trying to get to the next step. So keep it simple as possible, clear and simple. Don't put the word confidential on a slide deck if you don't have a non-disclosure agreement or a CDA with the company. That's important because many large companies will reject the deck, not share it with their internal people if it has the word confidential and they haven't signed a CDA. And that's because they don't want to have an implied confidentiality agreement. So take that off. It's important also to remember that a confidentiality agreement or an NDA typically doesn't protect you with any information that can be gotten by other means. That is, it only covers and protects that information which is not in the public domain. So putting the word confidential on there doesn't do you any good, and it might do you some harm. Confidentiality is typically restricted to information that is enabling of a competitor, and that might include things like unfiled patent applications or unpublished patent applications, chemical structures, manufacturing processes, trade secrets. Normally we don't think of biology results or even clinical results as enabling a competition. Competition might be interested in knowing it, but it doesn't change their ability to do anything. Sometimes we also hold back those things that we want to publish because a journal may require that it's not been shared in other forms. That's a judgment call. But there is a distinction now between the non-confidential and the confidential, and the non-confidential really is aiming to get to the confidential deck, so keep it nice and clear and simple. We touched on momentarily, and I want to elaborate on the fact that this deck is being used to communicate for you when you're not necessarily in the room. So it needs to be quite different from a great talk. If you've given lots of talks, you may be as elegant as Steve Jobs and put up a mere logo on the screen in black and white and be able to talk for 15 minutes in a crisp style. That deck won't do as a partnering pitch, because the partnering pitch needs to speak for you when you are not there. So you may want to think about having two versions. One version that you simplify as a spoken version, and the main partnering pitch that is a more complete, easy to find all those things that are necessary to explain every piece of the slides. I do like the idea that you practice even that longer partnering pitch as if it were a talk, because when I do things out loud, I find my logical flaws or things that don't flow, things I should have said earlier. So I think it is very valuable to walk through a partnering pitch even if you're going to email it. So how do you organize your information? Well, the most important thing is to put your contact information on there, typically on the first slide, maybe also on the last slide. The title slide has your contact information, but the first content slide is the absolute most important slide in your deck. And the way I often work through these things is I write one, and then I write the rest of the deck, and then I come back and rewrite my first slide, because it needs to reflect the whole deck. And if you don't catch them on that first slide, they may not pay attention from there on out. So that really should catch their attention with the big takeaway messages. And it should be aimed at your audience, aiming at addressing what's in it for them, why they should care, why this one. I like the first slide to set up the structure to guide the expectations of what's to come. And that's important because your audience may be distracted, may not be prepared for each of the steps along the way, and may get lost. So it's very useful to set up a structure and to clue them into what's to come. Common organizational structures include problem solution, stepping through the process of R&D, claims for superiority, and evidence for each claim. So here's a real live example. This is Pullan, a small drug delivery company, and their first content slide behind the title slide is a set of claims about what's exciting about Pullan. And their deck then follows with elaborations of each of these key points in greater detail. And at the end comes back and sort of reiterates these, perhaps in a slightly different form, as a summary of what has been heard, to leave it in their minds when you leave. Here's another example of a first slide. This is Genirvon, and it's a key messages first slide. Genirvon could be the first effective treatment for stroke, multifunctional mechanism, master switch, efficacious in animal models, da, 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 da. They're going to elaborate on each of these points further on in the deck. One of the things I really like to do, and I strongly urge you to get in the habit of doing, is to use each slide title as a message. You often see slide titles that say preclinical data. That's a waste of space. What does the preclinical data tell you? And that's the power of using these slide titles as messages, is you're really honing down on what's the important takeaway from each slide. In addition, the slide titles as messages can sort of lay out this organizational structure. So here's a real life example from Tinnitus, focused on allergy, where each slide title tells you the key components of their deck organization. And it's a very nice way to structure your deck and to make sure each slide really is interpreted correctly. In addition, here's another example from Array Biopharma. And my point here is that often what happens is when the deck is gone through once, you've gone through all the details, and then subsequently they go back and look at the deck. They actually flip through the slides and read those slide titles as sort of a summary of, oh yeah, that's what I heard, that's what I heard. You're putting in your best words the summary of what they heard, and that's really powerful. And again, it's reflecting the organization. Here's a sort of problem solution sort of structure, solution, efficacy, superiority, safety, and summary. Very powerful technique. I really strongly encourage everybody to think about using messages as slide titles. A small little tip is that, again, because a partnering presentation is different from a talk. In talks we're taught, make your slide fonts really big because you're going to show in an auditorium and you want the person in the back of the room to be able to read those slides. Partnering deck is typically read on a computer screen or on a piece of paper, and that makes the experience quite different. So often it's easier to read something that is smaller in font with more white space, more line spacing between them. And I do like that format, line spacing, add points after each line in the slide master to apply it to all the slides to make it easier to read. Similarly, fewer words often convey just as much information. So on the last slide I had complete sentences. I could have made that better by pruning out a bunch of words. And there's essentially no better content in the left example than in the right, and that's often the case. So take out words, use fragments. Sometimes in our world we do have pretty complex slides, multi-component slides, and so here's an example from Coyote where the title says that isomer mixture improves motor performance, etc. And there are 3 graphics. Each graphic has its own takeaway message above it in order to make it absolutely clear what the interpretation should be. Very good technique. Again, sometimes we do use pretty complex figures, and people may not spend the time they should to sort out exactly what the interpretation is. So guide them to the key part of a complex figure using circles, arrows, color. Really try to make it as easy as possible for your reader to get the key message out of that complex graphic. One of the things I've found only relatively recently in the last year or so has been the power of Microsoft's PowerPoint Smart Art. It's a tool that, yes, it's a graphic, but more importantly, it's a way to organize your structure visually. Here's an example from Genervon, where Genervon has multiple functions in their master regulators. It's a nice look, but it's also a simplification from what would have been a set of bullets. Here's another example from Genervon where they've got a list of fairly complex points on the right that through the use of smart art structure have been simplified down to some big concepts along the left. So you get the details, but you also get the big concepts. And you can tailor smart art graphics with color. There's a lot of different choices. You can use them in different ways so that they can be very individualized. It isn't too terribly limiting. Here's an example from Arcady of comparing 2 alternative treatments, surgery and his inadequate drugs competition. And again, the features of those are conveyed graphically. It's a powerful way to organize your thoughts in a visually attractive way. A little tip along the same lines in the use of bios, which are often hard to read and we rarely know the people's names, and yet we tend to use them. So add those corporate logos as a means to convey experience at a glance. The use of the logos really does catch the eye and says there's a lot of diverse experience. Finally, you want to respect the other party's email constraints and treat their inbox with kindness. You should keep it under 3 megabytes. If you need to shrink your PowerPoint, there's a trick in there where you choose one picture and under Format, choose Compress and apply to all, and you can shrink it a lot. And then finally make it into a PDF so that it is shared across platforms and prints properly and you don't have any Apple versus PC problems. So that's pretty much the way to make a better partnering presentation. It's really focusing in on the audience, what's in it for them, thinking about where you are in the partnering process, the key partners questions, and tailoring your message to the stage of the process, considering whether you include materials or don't include materials, structuring your story in a clear, transparent organization, guiding your reader through it, and a few tips and tricks, all geared to make it as easy as possible for them to get your story. thank you very much. We'll come back with Q&A, but at this point I'd like to turn it over to Steve Joseph for a demo of ShareVault. Thank you.
Linda, thank you very much for this in-depth and just the level of detail that you covered in your presentation. This wasn't just what to do, but also a why to do it and how to do it. That covered everything from some significant things dealing with fonts, but also down to subtleties such as reminding people that the audience is not just the people seeing the slide deck, but people that may see it later on when there's no presentation with it. So we really appreciate the level of detail that you covered in this presentation. Thank you again. While we're collecting questions now for the follow-on Q&A, which will take place just in a few minutes, I'm going to give you a brief demo that's going to, in a sense, continue this theme of ensuring an effective presentation to potential partners, but what you're presenting in this case is documents. And what you want to do is present documents to the prospective partners in a way that's simple, easy to access, and allows very quick access to the documents. Let me switch here to a browser. So we're going to go into a ShareVault that is a bare ShareVault. There's just a few things that have been preset in this data room. I'm going to log in as the administrator of a company called Cellgenics. And there is a confidentiality notice. This is one of the things that has been preset here. This is something that you can set up to be whatever text you want it to be, and you can have different versions for different parties coming into the data room. And then when we're in the data room, you'll see here that this is an empty data room with no documents available right now and no organizational structure that will appear here. In the next few minutes, just again while we're collecting questions, and we encourage you to submit them, I'm going to show you the use, how ShareVault can be set up in literally 5 minutes and be made and have those documents available for your partners. So I'm going to first put some documents in this data room. That's the starting place. And I have a choice here of either being able to pull documents from my local computer or from my network, or from ShareVault, from the new SharePoint connector that we now have. So ShareVault has created a new SharePoint connector that allows us to connect to a SharePoint site, which many companies do have, and bring in those documents from the SharePoint site. So I'm now looking at an organizational structure that actually exists on a live remote SharePoint environment. To start with, for this partnering demo and for the partnering purpose itself, you may just say, I'm going to share some corporate documents and some development documents. This is not a fundraising, so I'm not doing financials and legal and some of the others. But I just want to bring in those libraries or folders for my SharePoint site that I'm going to at least start with the partner and show first to the partner. What's happening right now is ShareVault has imported those documents to the staging area that includes, you'll see that there's a whole folder structure here along with a variety of documents, some of which are PDFs, but notice that some of them are actually Excel documents, Word documents, even an image document. Let me collapse that set of folders and documents. And one of the tremendous advantages, and this is again in the spirit of keeping things simple both for administrators as well as for users, is I'm going to create an organizational structure that mirrors what exists on my SharePoint site. So in just a few seconds here, I've now duplicated that structure that was in the SharePoint environment. And now when I publish these documents, and it'll just take a moment to publish the documents, there's 17 in this set, they're being uploaded. You will see shortly that those documents will now exist in the data room. They've been accepted and all published successfully. They now appear here in the data room, and we now have this organizational structure again that maps exactly to the SharePoint structure. Underneath it I've got corporate documents of a few different kinds, and I've got some development documents. Notice that they're both clinical and preclinical, and I can expand this down to as many levels as I want. What I also can do with the documents, and this is one of the other things that was preset, is just define some security policies for access to those documents. And I previously, and this only takes a minute or two, that define a view only, a saving okay, and a printing okay document. So there's some variations on what you can allow people to access that's appropriate, and I'll demonstrate exactly how that works now. The other thing that you want to do in a data room is obviously set up the access by the separate parties. So I'm going to add a group here that we'll call Pharma 1. And it has some intergroup privacy policies, which essentially means that this group can't be seen by any other groups and the members can't be. And they also cannot see any other groups themselves. And Pharma 1, when I start with, I'm going to share some documents in that same organizing structure. In this case, I will show them the disease fact sheet, but I'm not going to show them the bylaws of the company or the board documents. The disease fact sheet, in fact, this is where I deal with the document security policies. I don't care what they do with that. They can print that and save that. That's just fine to have. On the development side, I just want them to have the preclinical documents. I'm not even going to show them the clinical documents yet. And I'll add that group. When I do add that group, I'll add a user as well. And again, this will show you how quickly things can go. I'm going to add a user to the group, and all I need is an email address. And I add that user to the group. They are now a member of this group, and they only have access to those documents. Now I will invite that user to attend with access to the data room, and they've now been invited. If I go back to this data room, what we will see here is I can actually see what that user, I can look at what users get to see, and I have the documents all in place and protected. So one last thing before we shift to the questions and answers that I just want to show you is, even though we uploaded an Excel document, there's actually a PDF version behind some of these, and these documents are immediately available for users to access. There are many other features in ShareVault that we would love to demonstrate for people, but I wanted to show you that in just a few minutes, and literally the way I've done it here, this data room is accessible by an outside user, and I brought in a set of documents from another environment and permissioned them appropriately for that access. Okay. Switch now back to the Q&A and ask some questions.
Great. That was a nice demonstration of a powerful tool and with quite a bit of simplicity.
Thank you, Linda. Again, it is, as we, your point was, how do you make this simple? How do you make the presentation effective and make it easy for the user on the other side? Let me switch here just back to the slides. And I encourage you again to view that. There's some questions. Let me start with the set here. Adding company logos into the presentation specified from where the person came on board, I believe, is not appropriate until the company, it's a little bit hard to read. I think it's let me see if I can interpret the question. Do you have to have the company's approval to use their logo, I think is what the question is.
And that's a great question, and it may be that is appropriate. It's not commonly done, but that's a good question.
Another question is, how do you graphically show how a new technology can fit into the landscape of existing technologies? Is there a way to show that graphically?
There probably is. Virtually anything you can put in words, you can reduce to concepts and thereby reduce it to some sort of fairly simple graphic. So if you can put it out in a lot of words, prune down the words, keep pruning down until you're at your bare minimum conceptual framework, that can be made into a graphic. And would be
Another question is, do you have any guidance for international versus domestic decks in terms of content or style?
That's a great question, and I think it is true that when you're speaking to someone whose language is not your own, let's say is not English in this case, you actually have to work harder to make sure everything is clear. You probably should err on a bit more text than you would with a native English speaker. But if you work hard at the clarity for the native English speaker, that's easier to achieve from that version. But it really is an extra challenge.
The next question is, in your opinion, what is a good amount of slides for a partnering presentation that you would give in a remote environment, in other words, via a web conference?
Right. So I think of it again as dependent on the stage of discussion. Typically, the first interaction, you might aim for something of a half an hour length or shorter. I would say that the number of slides is less important than the length, and that if you have a complex slide, it's better to break it up into more slides than to keep that complexity. It's better to be clear with fewer things per slide and have a few more slides, and it probably won't take you any more time. So the time parameter is the key parameter, and the first presentation should probably be under 30 minutes. If you are invited back to talk to a larger audience, it might get longer.
There's a related question, Linda, that asks about the slides for a non-confidential presentation versus a confidential presentation.
Right, and confidential presentations are typically longer. That's a good thing to clarify before you actually give them. Confidential presentations are often tailored, again, both to the stage of the process and to the specific company or the audience you're talking to and their interests. But it's very good to clarify how much time do we have for this presentation if you're doing it over the phone or in person. And typically it would be something under an hour even then. So you might go from, say, a 20-minute presentation as a non-confidential to a 40-minute presentation as a confidential presentation. In your due diligence process, you might have multiple confidential presentations, each one of which might be 20 or 30 minutes, and those might be broken down into an overview, a focus on preclinical, a focus on clinical, a focus on regulatory, and each of those might be 20. That's how you get that huge deep dive that would be late in the process. So again, tailor it to your audience, to their concerns, and to where you are in the process.
Another question that's sort of post-presentation of the slides is, when we emailing out, actually, sorry, this is a different question. What is the right frequency of pinging your BD contact to figure out the status of the discussion?
Boy, that's a great question. I think I tend to go with the give them 2 weeks and then ping them. I've learned from experience that often things are not read, so the absence of a response does not mean a no. And so it is worthwhile to follow back up. People lose emails. I've been guilty of that occasionally. They forget things. So follow-up does work, and more than one follow-up does work. It does get more people. That's my own experience. But I don't have any great secrets to that either.
Another question is, do you ever recommend that your clients hire a PR agency to help them get the attention of potential partners through speaking engagements, press releases, etc.?
I do recommend PR agencies. I think press releases, you don't want thousands of them, but press releases at key events are a potent way. Getting interviews with journalists, speaking at conferences are all an important part of partnering. Indeed, the scientific presentations at conferences are your best way to build credibility and the internal champions. So I think both a PR agency and lots of posters, publications, presentations at scientific conferences are a very important part of building your reputation and your credibility. And remember, it takes a lot of time typically for a partnership to come to fruition, and during that time you're keeping an awareness, and PR agencies can help with that. Great question.
With regard to the appropriateness of requiring a CDA prior to an initial presentation to a representative of a venture fund, I've been advised that such a requirement is off-putting to them. Yet if I'm to disclose key technology for which I have not yet filed even a provisional patent application, I'm uneasy disclosing without a CDA. Do you have any comments on that?
Yes, that is a common dilemma. VC firms generally will not sign a CDA for first hearings, and I don't blame them. It's their time and energy to go into that. But sharing something that you haven't filed a provisional patent on is very dangerous. And to be honest, CDAs are a legal protection, but they may not be a practical protection. I think all of us have heard of cases, and this isn't necessarily limited to VCs, where despite it being confidential, word seeps around and you hear that somebody heard something they shouldn't have heard. It happens. So I really encourage you to file IP before sharing, and I know that's sometimes a real challenge because filing IP takes money. I haven't got a great answer to that dilemma.
Another question is, what is the best way to engage the potential partner the first time?
So I think I always advocate multiple ways to engage the potential partner the first time. I am a believer in broad outreach, and the easiest way to do broad outreach efficiently is email to a large number of potential partners. Partnering conferences can be a fairly efficient way to get your message out to interested parties who are out there seeking opportunities, and I represent multiple clients at a time at partnering conferences to make it more cost affordable and split the expenses across a number of clients. But I think the main message is keep working at lots of ways to do that outreach. Everything helps.
Here's a question involving a data room. They ask, when you make a data room available to a potential partner, do you typically tightly constrain the duration of availability of the data room?
I guess I would say the question is what the word tightly refers to. You want to give them enough time that they have a chance to get all their members in, but if they're not actively looking at it, and in ShareVault you can see who's looked at it and when and what they've looked at, if they're not actively looking at it and 2 months pass by, yeah, I'd shut it down. There's no point in putting stuff out that isn't being looked at. You might send them an email before that and say, I haven't seen any activity, the data room is open, have you had any problems? But yes, you do want to eventually turn it off if they're not pursuing it. You'll have a sense, if they are pursuing it, of some activity, and you can keep talking about what is their process, because that's really a key part of all this, is how are they working through this. Talk to the BD person and ask about their process to get to the next stage and what the expectations are. So you should have a sense of what the timing should be.
Another question is, if you know a BD person, a TA head, and other folks in a company, should you approach one or more with your proposal?
Yeah. So if you really know somebody, not just their name, but you have a relationship with them, those contacts can be very, very valuable. If you've already talked to the BD person, you should let them know that you're making these additional contacts, because it's a courtesy to them to manage the process. You should not send it unsolicited to the CEO unless you really know that CEO. It just irritates them, and it will get kicked back down to the BD person anyway. So the power of a real relationship is powerful. Otherwise, forget it.
Another question actually ties specifically to sort of making the slides, preparing the slides. Can you review where and how to get Smart Art?
It's part of Microsoft PowerPoint. It's on the menu, I believe it's on the Insert menu.
And then I have a question for you. If you've got some horror stories you can share about presentations that worked or didn't work.
Sure. Thought about this just a bit, and I think the number one horror story is technical challenges. There are so many presentations that I've been on the phone or on the webinar or to go to meeting sort of thing where there have been technical challenges. People get frustrated, they can't hear, they don't see. So that's probably the most common horror story. And it really does hurt your image. So if at all possible, practice your connection system. Provide slides by multiple routes. That is, if you're going to do a webinar, also send them ahead of time so that they can have an alternative to the webinar. Technical challenges can really hurt you, and it happens all too often.
There's a question about whether ShareVault is available in China, and my colleague John Badger is going to respond to that question.
As a matter of fact, we've had quite a few transactions in China, so there's no problem at all. ShareVault works effectively worldwide. We actually have Chinese character search, and all user-generated content is supported in Chinese. And in the next release of ShareVault coming next month, we will also have Chinese supported as a native language in the actual graphical user interface. So no problem at all with setting up deals in China.
Another question is, when emailing out a non-confidential deck as a first contact point with potential partners, how many slides or how long of a deck would you recommend?
So I would put a teaser as my written introduction, because they may not read your deck if you don't have some sort of little summary that gets them excited. So in your email cover letter, put your teaser. And then I'd aim for about 20-ish slides for my non-confidential.
Another question is, how do you get an introduction to a VC partner if you don't have someone to introduce? Is it okay to cold call or write?
It's certainly okay, and it's commonly done, but it's not nearly as powerful. I'm not an expert on fundraising, but I've seen enough to know that the introductions do matter. You should be able to find somebody who knows somebody, and to use that. You should have a scientific advisory board or a board of directors that have good connections. That's very important for raising money anyway. Remember, VCs care about the who, and you should tap those people's connections. You should tap key academics. If you're a young startup coming out of a university, academics have connections at VCs. You really, in VC world, do want to tap the power of the introducer. I've read a statistic, don't really know that this is true, that 99% of cold opportunities from VCs don't even get opened.
We have time for one more question, but we encourage you to continue to submit them. We will be responding to the questions even after the webinar. The last question is, for a 20-minute initial remote presentation, should I reserve minutes for Q&A, and how many minutes?
Absolutely reserve minutes for Q&A. So I like to try to reserve an hour and a half. That gives you lots of leeway. Most likely, you're not going to get that much time. So 45 would be a minimum, and an hour would be a great thing. But if I'm setting up a meeting, I try to make it an hour and a half, figuring we can always end early and no one will complain about being given free time.
Okay. Thank you, Linda, for addressing those questions. I'm now going to turn it back to John Badger, who will wrap up this webinar today.
Yeah, thanks, Steve and Linda, for handling the Q&A. The questions were excellent and made the presentation more interactive and more engaging. We welcome you to have a look at our website for the upcoming webinars. It's under the resources section on the website. In November, we'll be hosting a webinar on preserving privilege in IP transactions, and then in December, we've scheduled building a successful business development and licensing strategy. And although it's not yet on our website, in January we'll host the next of Linda's partnering sequence, which is Valuation of Your Drug Candidate. So this concludes the webinar. I'd like to thank all of you for attending today.
And I add my thanks too. Thanks very much. And thanks to ShareVault for hosting this.